All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Mindgasms. So, I am Andrew, aka Evil Critical Race Theorist Mindgasms, for the purposes of this video. Even though, no, I'm not actually a critical race theorist, but I talk about how public fraud intellectuals like James Lindsay spread a hell of a lot of misinformation about it and unnecessarily demonize it. So I'm going to do my second video here on the evil critical race theorist Derrick Bell's book called Silent Covenants and talk about how he basically had the opinion in his book called Silent Covenants about the American Supreme Court decision called Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 that desegregated black and white schools. He talks about how that was too progressive and an incrementalist approach would have been more useful and successful because just passing it as if just one pounding of the gavel by a judge can fix disproportionate educational outcomes for black students was naive, and it antagonized racist Democrats and Republicans into uh, into vehemently stopping any legal progress from there forward for the civil rights movement. So that's the reason that he saw it as a mistake. I'm going to talk about that and read some excerpts from Silent Covenant relating to that here, and go into Plessy versus Ferguson, which was a case that I believe it was in 1896 that preceded Brown versus Board of Education by a long time, obviously, and then get into, of course, the spiciest aspect of this video, how the the conservative economist Thomas Sowell, uh, literally compared Derrick Bell to Hitler at one point, in spite of the fact that he doesn't seem to be aware, or at least doesn't mention, that they actually have pretty much the exact same opinion about Brown versus Board of Education and the desegregation of black and white schools and how and why it was a failure. So I'm going to get into this short video first, explaining the Plessy versus Ferguson case, and then I'm going to go through those excerpts and then get to the Thomas Sowell bit there. Oops, I unfull screened that. There we go.
The Supreme Court's landmark ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson reversed nearly all the civil rights progress made during Reconstruction.
The Plessy decision is obviously a tremendous setback for African Americans in the 19th century. And the basic decision is a setback.
Homer Plessy was a 30-year-old shoemaker who was convicted of violating a Louisiana segregation law by refusing to sit in a blacks-only railroad car, although he was only 1/8 black. Ferguson was the judge who ruled against him in a lower court case. The Supreme Court decision in Plessy versus Ferguson maintained that segregation was legal so long as the railroad provided separate but equal accommodations for passengers.
Okay, so this is obviously people view it as like very similar to Brown versus Board of Education, but this time they decided that that segregation of black and white schools was legal, so they maintained the separate but equal clause. And if you watch my first video on Silent Covenants, you'll know that Derrick Bell thought that Brown versus Board of Education should have been more gradual instead, and the separate but equal clause should have been implemented. He doesn't think that the desegregation should not have happened, but he thought that it should happen with a series of more gradual measures in order to avoid antagonizing racist Republicans and Democrats into stopping further legal progress of the civil rights movement, as I said, right?
State legislatures responded quickly with laws reauthorizing segregation.
This gives the go-ahead to segregation in every aspect of Southern life, whether it's schools, public facilities, theaters, hospitals, you name it, cradle to grave segregation. Now, of course, separate but equal is a myth. These facilities were never equal. The black facilities were always far inferior.
And so the Plessy decision actually really does hinder what African Americans saw as the inevitable advancement toward a more integrated and egalitarian society.
This inequality, emphasized by the vast disparity between the facilities provided for whites and blacks, would not be challenged again in the courts until the mid-20th century.
All right. So as they said in that video related to Derrick Bell, he also would not say that, you know, desegregation shouldn't have happened. I mentioned this in my last video too. Contrary to what someone like James Lindsay might say, whereas claiming that Derrick Bell thought that black school desegregation was a mistake because black and white kids should actually literally be separate, like, you know, Malcolm X in his earlier black supremacist days before he learned the error of his ways and learned that you can work with white people to solve problems of racism. It actually was because he thought it would have been more successful with a much more incrementalist approach, of course. So I'm going to go through a few excerpts here from Silent Covenant with what Derrick Bell says about Plessy versus Ferguson and Board of Education, and then get to the spiciest part here with Derrick Bell Thomas Sowell rather, literally comparing Derrick Bell to Hitler. Okay. Oh, I went to the wrong one there. These tabs are not very specifically labeled. So go to this one first. No, that's not it. Oh my God, what is going on here? This one? Nope. Oh my God, this is fucking... I might give up on doing this and just read it from my tablet because these tabs are not working so well. Well, I'll just read these a little out of order because the most important part is to read the last one first. Okay, so the evening of May 17th, 1954 was a night for celebration. An office full of ecstatic NAACP workers in Manhattan, as well as black people throughout the country, were doing just as they hailed the bright new era all assumed would arrive with the landmark decision in Brown versus Board of Education handed down by the Supreme Court earlier that day. The case was not easily won. It was the culmination of 2 decades of planning and litigation. At the very least, a party was in order. So when it was passed at first, it seemed like a great success, and people had this notion that it was going to fix all the disproportionate educational outcomes of black students in comparison to white students. But of course, that's not actually what happened, right? Okay. So go to the next one here. Here it is. Okay. The Supreme Court, so this is referencing Plessy versus Ferguson that I showed earlier. Okay, so the Supreme Court's 1896 decision in Plessy versus Ferguson served to bring the law into a dismal harmony with the nation's view of race and life. The court decided that segregation in public facilities through separate but equal accommodations for black citizens would satisfy the Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment. So as I said, Derrick Bell, after the passing of Brown versus Board of Education, he realized that he said in the excerpt that I mentioned in my first video on this, that the separate but equal clause of the 14th Amendment is what should have been emphasized, although desegregation should have happened, but more gradually. And, you know, it should have actually happened in reality rather than just happening in theory, but people actually not carrying out the requirements of what was supposed to happen after Brown versus Board of Education. All right, so let's go to this one here. Okay. Its advocates, the advocates of Brown versus Board of Education, its advocates expected that the Brown decision would cut through the dark years of segregation with laser-like intensity. The resistance, though, was open and determined. At best, the Brown precedent did no more than cast a half light on that resistance, enough to encourage its supporters, but not bright enough to reveal just how long and difficult the road to equal educational opportunity would prove to be. Contending with that resistance made it unlikely that any of those trying to implement Brown, including myself, would stop to consider that we might be on the wrong road. So he talks about, Derrick Bell talks about how he had false assumptions about how much of a success the passing of Brown versus Board of Education and the desegregation of black and white schools would be in terms of the educational outcomes for black students. All right, so we're going to go to one last part here, and this is the most important and poignant part, I think, that Derrick Bell mentions. This part, this very last paragraph that I'll go to after this one here. Okay, so the white race deems itself to be the dominant race in this country, and so it is in prestige, in achievements, in education, in wealth, and in power. So, I doubt not, it will continue to be for all time if it remains true to its great heritage and holds fast to the principles of constitutional liberty. But in view of the Constitution, in the eye of the law, there is in this country no superior dominant ruling class of citizens. There is no caste here. Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. So that was the reasoning that at least one of the judges gave for passing Brown versus Board of Education, which overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. And I think this is the most interesting part that I alluded to earlier here. So, and this is not actually even Derrick Bell saying this, but he's mentioning this in the book here. As Duke University law professor Jerome Culp suggests, a gradualist approach would have been less acrimonious and would have avoided the emergence of political forces in both political parties, forces that have helped to elect every non-incumbent Republican president since that time. And, you know, he says that because Republicans tend to be, at least in the history of the U.S., have been harsher on legal legislation that would support the criminal rights movement in terms of desegregation and disproportionate educational outcomes, etc. Forces that have helped to elect every non-incumbent Republican president since that time and have created a minor political force inside the Democratic Party for cutting back the requirement of racial justice. So that's the most interesting excerpt of this that I'm showing you guys, to me, that basically he thought that a more gradualist approach to Brown versus Board of Education, and Derrick Bell agrees with this, as we saw in the first video in this series that I showed you, that Brown versus Board of Education, the instant desegregation in theory of black and white schools, was a mistake because a more gradualist approach would have been better, because the disproportionate educational outcomes of black students were not fixed at all by this, and a lot more work needed to be done. And because this was such a radical approach to this, what it did was antagonize Republicans and Democrats and incentivize them to cut back the requirement of racial justice in the changing of the laws. So that's why he sees it as a mistake. All right, so bear in mind that I wanted to include Thomas Sowell because I mentioned him in my first video, how he and Derrick Bell agree, and Sowell has mentioned this in his books and in many speaking engagements and interviews that he's had, that he and Derrick Bell totally agree that black school desegregation and Brown versus Board of Ed mistake, because a gradualist approach would have been better, because it antagonized Republicans and Democrats into fighting racial justice in the law for the civil rights movement from that point forward. So Thomas Sowell seems to not be aware of this, and given the way that he given the way that he paints Derrick Bell in this interview here. So I'm just going to show this clip here.
Correct me on the names and everything. Derrick Bell.
Yes.
Harvard Law School, black man.
Yes.
Threatened the law school if they didn't hire a black woman.
Yes.
He's going. He's leaving.
Well, no. Well, he's taking. If I understand it correctly, he's taking unpaid leave until such time as they hire a woman of color, as he says. But he's also said that by black, he does not mean skin color. He means those who are really black, not those who think white and look black. And so what he's really saying is he wants ideological conformity in the people that are hired to fill this.
Okay, so that is fair if that's true. Like if Derrick Bell doesn't see Thomas Sowell as a real black person, for example, then that's really stupid. Like you have to conform to my progressive ideology or whatever. But this is the problem. People like James Lindsay and Thomas Sowell mention this kind of shit about Derrick Bell, but they don't mention that he literally had a fucking conservative position about the desegregation of black schools and the Brown versus Board of Education case, and they act like he's just this cringy woke guy. And yeah, obviously that's a super progressive and cringy thing to not to want a person of color who agrees with your I don't even know the details, but I'm assuming your opinions about education and I don't know, other progressive political positions or something. But he is not like one of these fucking crazy woke people. He had some literally conservative positions, as I said, right?
Position. That's not uncommon either. I know a black woman, for example, who she has a PhD. She's had a book published. She's as a contractor on another book. She's taught at a couple of very nice places. She has a devil of a time getting a job, not a job in a prestigious institution, a job teaching at a college. And the reason is that she gets shot down, blackballed, whatever, by people who don't like her ideology. That's happening not only racially, it's also happening even to where race is not an issue. Or law school, I learned recently, there was a woman who was being considered for a 10-year position, and all the men voted for her and all the women voted against her because she does not follow radical feminism. And so you're getting these ideological tests so that at the very
Okay, well, like he doesn't know that though. He doesn't know that that's the reason. He's kind of just saying, and just like he did earlier, he did that here too. He's doing the fucking Kathy Newman that she did with Jordan Peterson. And those of you who follow my channel know that I criticize the fuck out of Jordan Peterson a lot, but it was unfair, that infamous moment in his interview with Kathy Newman where she said, "So what you're saying is," and then she said something completely the opposite of what he actually means. So that Thomas Sowell is doing the Kathy Newman shit here.
Every time that there's all this mouthing of the word diversity, there is this extremely narrow ideological conformity that's being enforced wherever people have the power to enforce it.
What did you think of Derrick Bell's whole plan?
Well, his chances of success will depend upon whether or not he's overestimated his importance to the Harvard Law School. I think it would be a tragedy if they caved in. And I was very pleased to see that they seem to show some backbone, which is quite rare among academics.
Now, what do you think of the press treatment of him?
He's been quite gentle.
I mean, is he a hero?
To me?
No, basically, I mean, from the press coverage you've seen, is he a hero to the...
Well, he's looked at as an idealist who is self-sacrificing and so on. I suppose one could have, if one wanted to look at it that way, seen Hitler that way in his early days. It's just a question of where that kind of idealism leads.
Okay, see, this is the stupid fucking slippery slope argument that makes no goddamn sense in this. And it makes me suspicious of how, and like I said in my first video, I'm a big fan of Thomas Sowell. He's one of the few conservatives who I'm a fan of, and I really like some of his books, like Black Rednecks and White Liberals and Intellectuals in Society and Intellectuals and Race. I'm not as much of a fan of his economic theories, but I'm not an economist, so that doesn't really matter. But yeah, he's written some good books, but he has some fucking stupid opinions sometimes, like literally comparing Derrick Bell to Hitler. Like, what is wrong with you, dude? If he had read Silent Covenants, I kind of doubt that he would actually have that opinion. And I'm not saying that he hasn't, but I'm saying that he's not familiar enough with his work to literally be fucking comparing him to Hitler. That's fucking ridiculous. Because, as I'll get into in my series, Derrick Bell thinking that the black school desegregation that happened due to the passing of Brown versus Board of Education, thinking that that was a mistake and an incrementalist or gradualist approach would have been better because it antagonized racist Republicans and Democrats, which stopped future racial justice. That is his one of his many conservative opinions about all of these issues. So, contrary to what intellectual public frauds like James Lindsay would say, and to people like Thomas Sowell, who is not an intellectual fraud. He's a good and respectable intellectual who makes some good points, even when I disagree with them. The impression of Derrick Bell that you would get from these people is that he's literally fucking comparable to Hitler. And I know James Lindsay sees all of the critical race theorists as like these fucking literal communo-fascists, this stupid nonsensical term that he totally made up based on going all fucking crazy and being an expert cherry picker. That's not at all what Derrick Bell is like.
He has launched a despicable attack on a young black professor at the law school who doesn't go along with this. A young man named Randall Kennedy, who's written a very...
Oh, I just noticed this. Keep in mind that this is Breitbart News. That's extremely right-wing. But I don't think Thomas Sowell is that as right-wing as Breitbart in general, I would say. I wouldn't say he's far right.
thoughtful, intelligent article last June in the Harvard Law Review, questioning some of the assumptions that people are making, people like Derrick Bell, and doing it in a very gentlemanly as well as...
You mean the assumption that black school desegregation and the case of Brown versus Board of Education was a mistake?
A very logical way, empirical way. And that's not what they want. They want the conclusion to be that they want him to march in lockstep, and he won't do it. And they're doing their best to make life impossible for him.
What do you think Harvard will do?
I've heard that Kennedy, and I don't know this, I've heard that he has tenure, and so I think that he may be all right.
But I mean, what do you think they'll do with
Derrick Bell?
Yes.
I hope that they will resist it, and since it's gotten so much publicity, I'm not sure they could stand to cave into it.
Wait, so he's worried about someone who can't get fired anyway because they have tenure? Then it kind of seems like you're making a mountain out of a molehill, if I'm understanding this correctly.
I was very pleased to see that Alan Dershowitz at Harvard had criticized this, and then he picked up on the fact that what Bell is really asking for is not only that people be hired by race, but that they be hired to fit Derrick Bell's ideology.
What would happen if this?
I agree that's bad if that's the case, because as many people and I have said before, what's most important is intellectual diversity. I don't give a shit about diversity in terms of people's physical characteristics, like their skin color or their genitals or anything like that. Intellectual diversity is what matters the most.
What's going on at Stanford Law School?
They'd have caved in long ago.
Stanford Law School.
Yes, I think so. It's a judgment call, but that's my judgment.
I think that's a bit of an exaggeration to say the least, because this interview is really old. Like, it was back in the, I'm not sure when it was exactly, but I think it's the 90s or early 2000s, perhaps.
Why would they do it so quickly?
Just looking at their track record. I mean, they have
That's not really much of a reason.
perfected the technique of preemptive surrender.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So yeah, I thought that would be interesting to go into the details of Derrick Bell's actual opinion on black school desegregation and his literally conservative opinion about this case, and compare that to Thomas Sowell's impression of him, even though they literally totally agree about black school desegregation and Brown versus Board of Education, and how we literally compared him to Hitler. Now, the woke shit can be a problem, of course, as I admitted there. Like, you know, if that's true about Derrick Bell, that he didn't want a black person to be hired because they didn't agree with his opinions enough, then that's definitely not fucking good. But even like, given his other opinions especially, but even if that were not the case, he's still nowhere near fucking bad as Hitler, especially if you do take into consideration his various conservative opinions about some legal cases like that. So anyway, thought you liked that, or hope you liked that. Check out my next video in this series on silent covenants. I'll probably do, oh yeah, hopefully tomorrow I'm gonna do my next movie chat with Dusty and Chris, who I often do movie chats with, on the documentary called Reversing Roe, a new one on Netflix that is about the decades-long process that led to the overturning of Roe versus Wade in the US recently. So we're going to talk about that. And some of you who are watching this know my opinion that I'm pro-choice, and I had a way too fucking vehement debate with my Christian friend a long time ago about it. But and this documentary is biased toward that side, but it does give merit without being overly critical to the other side as well. So I like that, even though I disagree with the other side of the argument. So check that out, and check out my last video that is surprisingly popular, where I was criticizing the dumb opinions of Ben Shapiro and Sam Harris and their debate on morality that happened relatively recently. And yeah, subscribe to the channel, click that like button, share this everywhere. Look forward to the next Silent Covenants video and that movie chat tomorrow. Click that bell to be notified when I come out with new videos. Check out my Patreon page. The link is in the description as always. And always remember this: I love you all. Keep being the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And most importantly, also always remember this: the funk cures all, and groove is in the heart. And actually read work by evil critical race theorists like Derrick Bell. If you do, you'll find out that they're nowhere near as bad as intellectual frauds like James Lindsay and respectable intellectuals like Thomas Sowell claim that they are. If you read books, you often find out that people who are demonized, even fucking right-wingers like Charles Murray, are nowhere near as bad as they're painted by people like Charles Murray, for example, on the opposite end of the spectrum politically. I think he has some dumb pseudoscientific opinions about race and IQ, for sure, but he's not a fucking white supremacist, in my opinion. And I think Derrick Bell's work is actually has a lot more merit to it than someone like Charles Murray. So anyway, read Silent Covenants. I was just reading it from you on archive.org. Anyone can get it from this library for free. So it's your own fucking fault if you're uneducated, because you can get this book for free. Don't be intellectually lazy. Actually read books instead of just believing bullshit like that people like James Lindsay say about it. All right. So thanks again, everyone, and adios until